intriguing when you start looking into it. He's not suggesting that the gospel is hard to understand or requires a university degree to understand. Mystery in the Bible is something that human minds would not have been able to work out on their own. It's something that God has to reveal to us. That's what the mystery is in the biblical sense of the word. And in this context here in Ephesians, it's all about the things that we also talked about last week. The fact that Gentiles who believe in Jesus would be welcomed into the people of God on equal footing with the Jews who believed, with no further requirements. That is what Paul is referring to as a big mystery here, that they wouldn't have understood without God's revelation. Even though, as I pointed out, it wasn't really hidden. The Old Testament contained hints that this was going to happen, but nobody really understood it until God made it happen. The Holy Spirit was poured out on a Gentile household in Acts 10, the house of Cornelius, the Roman officer, and it wasn't immediately accepted. Peter had to have a revelation from God in order to go to Cornelius' house, and when he came back, he was criticized and he had to explain himself in Acts 11. And that's what Paul is saying, that the apostles and prophets, they had to have this revealed to them by God so that they could then explain it to the rest of the church. And it took a while for it to be accepted. But Paul is here saying he's one of them. He has been called to be an apostle. And this good news and the message of this good news, the mystery of the gospel, if you like, has been given to him. It's God's gift of grace to Paul to preach the gospel. Now, Paul knew a lot about God's grace. He writes a lot about the grace of God. And if you think about it, Paul had persecuted the church. We have that at the kind of near the beginning of Acts. Paul was a persecutor. He's approved of the execution of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, and probably a fair few after that. He was a pretty bad guy, even though he was very highly regarded by the religious establishment. And then Jesus appeared to him and saved him. And I don't think he could ever cease to marvel about this saving grace. I don't think he ever got over the fact that God would forgive somebody like him. He'd been persecuting the Messiah. He'd been killing people that kind of supported and served the Lord. And God forgave him. I think he never really got over how amazing, how marvelous that was. And then he says that gift of grace didn't just stop with him being forgiven and kind of included in the people of God. God also gave him this right or privilege, if you like, to preach this good news to the Gentiles. He sees it as a gift of grace, probably partly because one of the reasons that he hated the church so much was that the church seemed to be willing to include Gentiles. And obviously as a Pharisee, as a Jew, he couldn't accept that. So he sees it as an expression of God's grace that Jesus then called him to preach this very message to the Gentiles. I see it as an expression of God's sense of humor, or divine justice, if you like. Because, well, here we are. Paul, the persecutor, has suddenly become Paul, the preacher. The early church avoided him. We have that in Acts. They didn't really trust that he had been converted. They wanted to see evidence, a certificate maybe. Some may have wanted him punished. I wouldn't be surprised if there were people in the church in Jerusalem who would quite happily have Paul executed because he had been executing their people. And if they were praying about it, well, then we have God's answer. God said, nah, not going to do that. Instead, let's have him suffer with the church. Let's have him suffer the same things that he inflicted on others. That is poetic divine justice. He persecuted the church for the gospel. Now let him preach the gospel and let him suffer the same persecution. So that's what happened. And the thing is, Paul isn't upset about it. On the contrary, he sees it as an expression of God's grace. He's grateful to God for this privilege to proclaim the gospel, God's truth, to the Gentiles. And it's a bit sad, I think, that most of us quite often feel that it's a burden, it's a difficult duty to have to share the gospel with people. We're nowhere near as excited about it as Paul was. And I mean, Paul was Paul, we can't compare ourselves to him, but it's still something to look at. He was so excited that even though he had to suffer for the gospel, he saw that as a privilege, and he couldn't stop himself from sharing, because he really knew just how amazing the gospel was. He really knew the boundless riches of Christ, and he wanted everybody to understand this. And as I said, it's hard work, because not even the early Christians understood it. And even Christians today don't always understand the riches of God's grace, don't understand just how amazing this message is, that we don't have to earn our salvation. And of course, for the Jews in Paul's days, the problem was this whole thing with the Gentiles. They didn't understand what Paul calls the administration of this mystery, how God's plan is working out in the non-Jewish world. It really did take divine revelation for the church to understand this mystery, that the good news is good news for everyone. So that is quite amazing on its own. But then Paul goes on to say something even more amazing, even more, thought-provoking, marvelous, whatever you like. He tells us that the church is God's means of revealing this good news, this plan, this mystery to not just to the world, but to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. The heavenly realms, there we have it again. It's the fourth time Paul has mentioned the heavenly realms in this letter. And we're still only at the beginning of chapter 3. And this time, he's talking about a different category of inhabitants of the heavenly realms. Because first it was just God the Father, then it was Jesus being seated, then we were seated in the heavenly realms. Now we have the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms, which is another category that is maybe harder to pinpoint than God the Father, God the Son, and us, the church. But the way Paul uses this expression, it seems to blend what we would call spiritual powers and earthly authorities. It kind of moves between all the way from Satan on the one hand and the emperor or the local magistrates on the other hand. And it's probably because sometimes it is hard for us to tell them apart. It's hard for us to tell now who is actually operating here, because very often there are spiritual rulers and authorities operating behind the scenes through the earthly rulers and authorities, which are the ones that we interact with. In chapter 6, we'll come back to the rulers and authorities, where Paul talks about the armor of God, and he tells us that when we are being attacked, we shouldn't worry about the human side of it. Let's not focus on our human opponents. Focus on the spiritual powers that are behind the humans, because our battle isn't against flesh and blood, but against these evil entities in the heavenly realms. We'll get back to that when we get to chapter 6, because here Paul takes a slightly different angle. Because here he is saying that God planned to make his wisdom known to these rulers and authorities, to prove to them that Jesus has achieved exactly what God said he would do. He's defeated sin, he's defeated death, he's created this new humanity that we heard about last Sunday. New humanity that will dwell forever with Jesus in the restored creation. Jesus has done this. God has achieved exactly what he set out to do, and the proof, the evidence, is the church. It's us. We are exhibit A. We are the evidence that God has done what he set out to do. We are the evidence that God will be presenting to the heavenly courtroom, if you like. And just as in a murder mystery, the evidence will be scrutinized. So then it kind of comes back to us. How are we supposed to showcase God's manifold and mysterious and victorious wisdom to these heavenly realms? Well, I think I came up with mainly 3 ways that we as a church, and not just us obviously, but the Church of Jesus Christ worldwide, that we showcase God's wisdom. And it's through our proclamation, through our worship, and through our existence. Please take note of this. I don't often have 3 points in my sermons. Proclamation, well, we declare Christ died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. That is something that you may recognize from other churches. Should we say that out loud together? 1, 2, 3. Christ died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. That may not make a big impression on the earthly rulers around us, but I don't think Satan likes being reminded of Jesus' victory. But it's not only here. Proclamation isn't just what we do when we come together on a Sunday morning. As I said before, our Sunday morning gatherings are really just meant to equip us for all the rest of our lives outside the walls of the church building. So whenever you share the gospel with a friend, a co-worker, a family member, a neighbor, you're doing this. You're proclaiming the wisdom of God every time you share the gospel somewhere. Obviously, our worship fits in a similar category. Our genuine devotion to Jesus, whether it's through our singing or through our praying or through celebrating communion, which we will be doing in a little bit, this makes a loud statement in the heavenly realms. And of course, Romans 12:1 tells us that worship isn't just what we do in church. It isn't just our singing or praying. It is our whole lives. So when we live our whole lives for the glory of God, whether at work or at school or in our social life, our leisure, we showcase that this new humanity is already here. God's wisdom is on full display in you and me during the week outside these walls, which of course links with our existence. Did you think that was a strange word to use here? I think that's actually the main point that Paul is making here, and it's of course linked to the other 2. The church itself, the existence of a body of people all around the world made up of, as I said, young and old, rich and poor, black and white and yellow and green and blue and red and whatever. We're all showcasing the wisdom of God because we show that God has achieved what he set out to do. When we live out God's love and compassion, forgiving each other, forgiving others around us, even though they don't deserve it, we prove that God's love has overcome sin and selfishness. Hello, you. When we live in peace and unity with people around us and with people who are not like us, people different to us, we prove that God's peace has broken down those sinful barriers of hostility and suspicion, which is something the world very much needs to see. But also the fact that we are still here, in a way, shows that God is in our midst, that God is working through his church. The church is one of the strongest pieces of evidence there is that the gospel is true. How else would the gospel have spread if there wasn't the power of the living God behind the proclamation of the early church? Yeah, there was this preacher in Galilee, and the Jewish leaders had him crucified, the Romans nailed him to a cross, but he's alive and he's the king of the world. I mean, that is a ridiculous message. If that message hadn't had the power of God behind it when the gospel started spreading, there is no way we would be here today. The fact that the church has survived through the centuries, external persecution, internal corruption, but here we still are proclaiming that Christ died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. That is really strong evidence that God has done exactly what he set out to do. And the fact that we are being persecuted is not a problem. Paul was in prison when he wrote this letter, which is why he says, don't be discouraged because of my sufferings. because suffering for Christ is natural. It's what's going to happen. The rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms don't like the preaching of the gospel. But they're going to come to a sticky end. The book of Revelation is a complicated book, I admit that. It was probably the first Bible book I read, long before I could understand any of it, really. And I might preach through the book of Revelation one day. I quite like it. It might be worthwhile. But I can tell you this one thing. The main message of Revelation is very plain and simple. Jesus wins. That's the main point. If you don't know anything else about Revelation, that's the main point. Jesus wins in the end. And the church shares his victory. And at that point, all these powers and authorities, human or demonic or whatever, will see the triumph of Jesus, the wisdom of God, the new humanity in this new creation, living freely in the presence of God. We have a small foretaste of that. We've had that in the previous passage, and we had it in this one as well, free access to the throne of God. Or we are still sort of hampered by the fact that our sinful nature still pops up and tries to distract us. There are temptations. The world, the flesh, and the devil is trying to make us not approach the throne of God. So it's not still as easy as it seems, but we do have the free access, and one day all those obstacles will be gone. One day these great promises, this great victory, will all be fully implemented, thanks to Jesus. So we're going to move on to some proclamation. You may wonder why we didn't sing very much before the sermon. We're going to sing now. We're going to sing praises to the Lord who has saved us, and then we'll celebrate communion together. And all of this is with one purpose, is to proclaim that Jesus has achieved what he